A quiet arrival. The airport terminal was a symphony of movement, the chatter of travelers mixing with the hum of rolling suitcases. Among the crowd, Lucy Barnes moved with quiet determination. A black woman in her late 30s, Lucy wore a tailored navy suit that exuded professionalism. Her gait was purposeful but unhurried, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings as she approached the security checkpoint. Lucy was no stranger to airports. As a seasoned naval officer, she had traveled extensively for her work. Today, however, was different. She was en route to an international summit where she would represent not just her fleet but her country. For Lucy, it was an honor and a responsibility she carried with pride, though she preferred to remain under the radar. Her rank of Rear Admiral was not something she flaunted, but the weight of her achievements was undeniable. At the security line, Lucy placed her carry-on bag on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector. The machine remained silent, and she allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. She was on schedule and everything was proceeding smoothly. That was until two security officers stepped forward, blocking her path. "Excuse me, ma'am, we need to inspect your bag," the male officer said, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Lucy's brows knitted in confusion. "Is there an issue with my luggage?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer, whose name tag read Grant, met her gaze with a smirk. "We've received orders to inspect the baggage of a suspicious individual." "Open your bag." Suspicious individual. The term struck Lucy like a slap. She fought to maintain her composure as a simmering anger threatened to surface. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone sharpening slightly. Grant's smirk widened. "Comply, or we'll be forced to detain you." Taking a deep breath, Lucy stepped aside and opened her bag. She knew better than to make a scene, especially in a public setting where biases could quickly turn against her. Still, the indignity of the situation gnawed at her. As Officer Grant and his partner, a woman named Burns, rifled through her belongings, Lucy could feel the judgmental stares of other travelers. Whispers began to circulate, their words indistinct but their tone unmistakably accusatory. Burns' hands moved with deliberate carelessness, treating Lucy's personal items with a disdain that felt intentional. At one point, she muttered under her breath, "Always causing trouble," loud enough for Lucy to hear. Lucy's jaw tightened. She had faced prejudice before, but this level of blatant disrespect was infuriating. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, raising her voice slightly. "Because this doesn't seem like standard procedure." The nearby crowd had grown larger, their gazes heavy with curiosity and judgment. Lucy felt the weight of their stares, each one like a physical burden pressing down on her. She could see the assumptions forming in their minds, their biases laid bare in their expressions. Finally, Officer Grant pulled something from her bag and held it up triumphantly. It was a small, gold-plated badge, not a toy but a ceremonial pin she had received for her years of service. "Cute," Grant said with a sneer. "But it's not allowed on the plane." Without waiting for an explanation, he tossed it into a nearby trash can. Lucy's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The badge was more than just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of her dedication and sacrifice. Seeing it discarded so carelessly felt like a deep, personal insult. But she forced herself to remain silent, knowing that any outburst would only escalate the situation. "You're free to go," Grant said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if she were an inconvenience rather than a human being with dignity. Lucy took a moment to compose herself before closing her bag and walking away. Her stride was steady, her head held high, but inside, a storm raged. She had faced countless challenges in her career, yet the blatant disrespect she had just endured cut deeper than she expected. As she approached her gate, Lucy replayed the incident in her mind, each detail stoking the fire of her frustration. She knew she couldn't let this moment define her day. She had a mission to fulfill, and her focus needed to remain on the summit. Still, the sting of humiliation lingered, a bitter reminder of the prejudices that persisted even in spaces meant to be neutral. When it was time to board, Lucy presented her ticket and made her way to her seat in first class. The luxury was well earned after years of grueling work and countless sacrifices. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, hoping for a moment of peace. But peace was fleeting. A passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a suit, glanced at her and muttered under his breath, "How does someone like her afford first class?" Another passenger chimed in, "Probably one of those special programs. Doesn't belong here, that's for sure." Lucy's grip on the armrest tightened, but she refused to react. She turned her gaze to the window, focusing on the runway as the plane prepared for takeoff. The comments continued, their voices low but their intent clear. Even the flight attendants seemed uneasy, their glances toward her filled with hesitation. The lead flight attendant approached, her expression cold and unyielding. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your ticket again," she said. Lucy handed it over without a word, her patience wearing thin. The attendant examined it before tearing it in half. "You'll need to move. This seat isn't available to you anymore." Shock coursed through Lucy. "This ticket was purchased in my name. I have every right to be here." The attendant's gaze hardened. "Take it up with someone else. I'm not about to debate this with you." Lucy stood, gathering her belongings as whispers and smirks spread among the passengers. She walked to the back of the plane, her posture rigid with suppressed anger. Taking her new seat, she stared straight ahead, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Despite the humiliation, Lucy refused to let the incident break her spirit. She reminded herself of the importance of her mission, of the people she represented. She had endured worse and emerged stronger. This, too, would pass. Little did she know, the flight ahead would test her resolve in ways she could never have anticipated. By the time the journey ended, the very people who had looked down on her would see her in a completely different light, not as a passenger, but as their savior. Turbulence in the skies. Lucy stared out the small airplane window, the clouds rolling by in an endless sea of white. Her jaw was set, her thoughts racing. The humiliation she had endured during boarding clung to her like a second skin, but she refused to let it consume her. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, focusing on the rhythmic hum of the airplane's engines. Despite everything, she needed to stay composed. Her mission demanded it. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, distributing drinks and snacks. Lucy declined both. The sharp tension in her chest made it impossible to eat or drink. She couldn't shake the disapproving glances from passengers around her, their judgment a constant hum in the background. Then, just as she began to feel some semblance of calm, a commotion broke out in the first-class cabin. She turned her head, straining to see what was happening. Voices rose in panic, and a flight attendant hurried past her toward the front of the plane, her face pale. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a situation, and your cooperation is required." "Thank you." Lucy's training kicked in immediately. Her senses heightened, and her body tensed. She scanned the cabin, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. A man in a dark hoodie was standing at the front, near the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. His stance was aggressive, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Lucy's heart sank. She knew that posture too well. It was the stance of someone holding a weapon, and someone prepared to use it. The whispers around her turned to murmurs of fear as passengers began to realize what was happening. Lucy glanced at the flight attendant who had just rushed past. She was now standing frozen near the galley, her eyes wide with terror. Another attendant was trying to calm a crying child 2 rows ahead. "Stay calm," Lucy muttered to herself. She had faced danger before, but this was different. She was unarmed, and every movement she made could put the entire cabin at risk. The man in the hoodie stepped forward, his voice booming. "Listen up. No one moves, no one speaks unless I say so. If you follow my instructions, no one gets hurt. Understand? A few passengers nodded fearfully. Lucy noticed how his eyes darted around the cabin, assessing the passengers. When his gaze landed on her, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than it did on anyone else. A sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth before he moved on. Her mind raced. She had no way of knowing if he was alone or if he had an accomplice. She needed more information. As quietly as she could, she unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned slightly into the aisle to get a better view. The man was pacing now, gesturing with one hand while the other remained in his pocket. "Empty your pockets," he barked at a man in the first row. "Phones, wallets, jewelry, put it all in the bag." He tossed a small duffel bag at the man's feet. The passenger hesitated, and the man in the hoodie took a menacing step forward. "Do it. Now." The terrified passenger obeyed, his trembling hands fumbling as he emptied his pockets. Lucy's jaw clenched. She couldn't let this escalate, but she also couldn't act recklessly. As the man continued to intimidate the passengers in first class, Lucy turned her attention to the back of the plane. She needed to assess her environment. Her gaze landed on an elderly man seated a few rows behind her. His eyes met hers, and he gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of solidarity, and Lucy felt a flicker of hope. At least someone was paying attention. Then, the man in the hoodie pulled something from his pocket. It wasn't a gun but a small black device with a single button. He held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, his voice cold and deliberate, "is a detonator. My partner is sitting in the cargo hold. If I press this button, we all go down. Do I make myself clear?" The cabin erupted in gasps and soft sobs. The crying child from earlier wailed louder, her mother trying desperately to soothe her. Lucy's heart sank. This wasn't just a robbery. This was something far more dangerous. The man's eyes scanned the crowd again, and Lucy forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't let him see her fear. Fear gave people like him power. Instead, she focused on her breathing, slowing her racing heart. She needed to think clearly. "All right," the man barked. "Flight attendants, start collecting everyone's belongings. Phones first." The attendants hesitated, their fear palpable. When they didn't move quickly enough, the man slammed his fist against the overhead compartment, causing several passengers to flinch. "Now," he shouted. The attendants sprang into action, moving down the aisle with trembling hands. Lucy watched their every move, noting how they avoided eye contact with the passengers. They were terrified, but they were also trying to keep the situation from spiraling further out of control. Lucy's mind raced. She needed to find a way to communicate with the elderly man who had nodded at her earlier. He might be an ally, but she couldn't risk drawing attention to herself. She also needed to assess whether the man's claim about a partner in the cargo hold was true. If it was, the stakes were even higher than she thought. Taking a deep breath, Lucy decided to act. She raised her hand slowly, drawing the man's attention. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "What?" he snapped. "I need to use the restroom," she said, her voice calm and steady. The man stared at her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to grant her request. Finally, he nodded. "Make it quick," he said. "And don't try anything stupid." Lucy stood, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She walked down the aisle, her eyes meeting the elderly man's as she passed. He gave her another slight nod, and she felt a surge of determination. They weren't powerless. Not yet. In the restroom, Lucy splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her mind raced with possibilities. She didn't have much time, but she needed a plan. There were lives at stake, and she wasn't about to let this man's threats dictate the outcome of this flight. She straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. She was Lucy Barnes, a rear admiral in the United States Navy. She had faced adversity before and come out stronger. This was no different. As she exited the restroom, her resolve solidified. Whatever it took, she would protect the people on this plane. A dangerous gambit. Lucy returned to her seat, her steps deliberate and unhurried. The cabin was eerily quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some filled with fear, others with cautious hope. As she settled back into her seat, the elderly man from earlier caught her gaze again. His silent nod reaffirmed his trust in her, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The man in the hoodie continued to pace near the front of the cabin, his movements erratic and his grip on the detonator firm. His threats hung heavy in the air, but Lucy had noticed something during her brief trip to the restroom. His hand, though steady, trembled slightly when he spoke about the detonator. She wasn't sure if it was fear or hesitation, but it was a crack in his facade, one she could potentially exploit. Lucy glanced at the flight attendants, who were still collecting phones and other valuables from the passengers. Their movements were robotic, their fear palpable. She needed to find a way to communicate with them without drawing the hijackers' attention. Her eyes landed on a pen sticking out of the pocket of one of the attendants. An idea began to form. She leaned slightly into the aisle, catching the attention of the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with wide, frightened eyes. Lucy mouthed the words, "pen and paper." The woman hesitated, glancing nervously at the hijacker, but Lucy's steady gaze seemed to reassure her. Slowly, the attendant slipped the pen and a small notepad from her apron and dropped them onto Lucy's tray table as she passed by. Lucy lowered her head, pretending to write something trivial. Instead, she scrawled a quick message. "I'm trained. Need allies. Is he alone?" She folded the paper and waited for the right moment. When the attendant passed by again, Lucy discreetly slipped the note into her hand. The woman's fingers closed around it, and she gave the smallest of nods before moving on. Now all Lucy could do was wait. The hijacker's voice boomed again, breaking the tense silence. "Hurry up. I don't have all day." He gestured aggressively at the flight attendants. One of them flinched, nearly dropping the bag of collected items. The passengers shrank further into their seats, their fear palpable. Lucy's jaw tightened. She hated feeling powerless, but she knew better than to act impulsively. Timing was everything, and she needed more information before making her move. Her eyes flicked to the elderly man again. He was watching her closely, his expression calm but resolute. She could tell he was ready to act if needed, but like her, he was waiting for the right moment. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, leaning down as if to adjust Lucy's tray table. She slipped a folded note onto the tray and moved on without a word. Lucy unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding. He's alone. No partner. Detonator likely fake. Relief and anger surged through Lucy simultaneously. If the detonator was fake, it meant the man had been bluffing about blowing up the plane. But that didn't make him any less dangerous. He still had a weapon, and a plane full of terrified passengers at his mercy. Lucy scribbled another note. Distract him. I'll act. She handed it back to the attendant, who nodded subtly before disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Lucy's mind raced, running through scenarios and strategies. She had no weapon, no backup, and no guarantee that the hijacker wouldn't react violently. But she couldn't sit by and do nothing. Lives were at stake, and she had the training to make a difference. The hijacker turned suddenly, his eyes scanning the cabin. Lucy froze, her hands resting casually on her lap. His gaze landed on her, and she felt a jolt of adrenaline. For a moment, he seemed to recognize her as more than just another passenger. His sneer returned. "You," he said, pointing at her. "What's your deal? You've been awfully quiet." Lucy met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. "I'm just trying to stay out of your way," she said evenly. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than everyone else here? Sitting there all high and mighty?" Lucy's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "No," she said. "I'm just doing what you asked. Staying quiet, staying calm." The hijacker stared at her for a long moment before letting out a harsh laugh. "Smart move. Keep it that way." He turned and resumed his pacing. Lucy exhaled silently, her mind working overtime. She needed to act soon, but she couldn't do it alone. She glanced at the elderly man again and gave him the smallest of nods. He nodded back, understanding passing between them without a word. The flight attendant reappeared at the front of the cabin, her voice shaking but audible. "Excuse me, sir," she said to the hijacker. "We need to check on the passengers in the back. Some of them are feeling unwell." The hijacker frowned, his grip on the detonator tightening. "No one moves without my say-so." "It's just a routine check," the attendant said, her tone soothing. "We want to keep everyone calm." He hesitated, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But make it quick." The attendant moved toward the back of the plane, stopping briefly at Lucy's row. "Ma'am, would you mind helping us? You seem capable." Lucy nodded, catching the underlying meaning in the attendant's words. She stood and followed the woman toward the galley. As they passed the elderly man, she caught his eye and saw the resolve there. He was ready. In the galley, the flight attendant turned to Lucy, her hands trembling. "What's the plan?" she whispered. Lucy's voice was steady. "We need to create a distraction. Something that will draw his attention long enough for me to act." The attendant nodded. "What do you need?" "Get him to step back into the economy cabin," Lucy said. "Once he's away from the cockpit, I'll take it from there." The woman's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Okay. I'll do it." Lucy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can do this. Just stay calm." As the flight attendant returned to the front of the cabin, Lucy took a deep breath. Her plan was risky, but it was their best chance. She could feel the weight of the passengers' lives on her shoulders, and she was determined not to let them down. The moment of truth was approaching, and Lucy knew there was no turning back. She tightened her fists, her resolve hardening. This was her mission now, and she wouldn't fail. The strike. Lucy steadied her breathing as she watched the flight attendant move toward the hijacker. Each step felt like an eternity, but she couldn't let impatience cloud her focus. This was a pivotal moment. One misstep could spell disaster for everyone on board. The flight attendant reached the hijacker, her body language calculated to appear nervous yet cooperative. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic, "a passenger in the economy section is having a medical emergency. We'll need your permission to assist them." The hijacker turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of emergency?" he demanded. "They're having trouble breathing," the flight attendant replied. "It could be serious." The man hesitated, suspicion flickering across his face. Lucy tensed, ready to intervene if needed. She could see the internal battle playing out in his mind. Allowing the flight attendant to move freely could compromise his control, but ignoring a potential emergency might spark unrest among the passengers. "Fine," he said finally, his tone grudging. "But I'm coming with you." Lucy suppressed a grimace. This wasn't ideal, but it was still an opportunity. She shifted in her seat, preparing herself for what was to come. The hijacker followed the flight attendant toward the back of the cabin, his posture rigid and alert. As he passed Lucy's row, their eyes briefly met. His gaze lingered, his distrust evident, but he said nothing. The elderly man seated a few rows behind Lucy made his move. He coughed loudly, drawing the hijacker's attention for a split second. It was all the distraction Lucy needed. With practiced precision, Lucy rose from her seat and lunged forward. Her movements were swift and fluid, years of training coming to the forefront. She grabbed the hijacker's wrist, twisting it sharply to force the detonator from his hand. The man let out a startled cry, his free hand swinging toward her in an attempt to retaliate. Lucy dodged the blow, maintaining her grip on his wrist. The detonator clattered to the floor, and she kicked it away, sending it skidding down the aisle. A passenger scrambled to retrieve it, clutching it tightly as they moved out of harm's way. The hijacker snarled, his strength surprising, but Lucy held her ground. She twisted his arm further, forcing him to his knees. The passengers watched in stunned silence, their fear momentarily giving way to awe. "Stay down," Lucy commanded, her voice cold and authoritative. But the hijacker wasn't finished. With a sudden burst of energy, he wrenched himself free and stumbled to his feet. His hand darted toward his pocket, and Lucy's heart sank. She had no way of knowing if he had another weapon. Before he could act, the elderly man stepped into the aisle, his movements surprisingly quick for his age. He swung his cane with precision, striking the hijacker's hand and sending the object he had been reaching for flying across the cabin. The hijacker howled in pain, clutching his injured hand. Lucy seized the opportunity, tackling him to the ground. She pinned him with her full weight, using her elbow to immobilize his arm. "Someone get the zip ties from the emergency kit," she shouted. A flight attendant hurried forward, her hands shaking as she retrieved the kit from an overhead compartment. She handed the zip ties to Lucy, who secured the hijacker's wrists with practiced efficiency. The man thrashed and spat curses, but he was firmly restrained. The cabin erupted in applause and cheers, the passengers' relief palpable. Some wept openly, their fear finally giving way to gratitude. Lucy rose to her feet, her breathing heavy but steady. She glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had moments ago doubted her. "Is everyone okay?" she asked, her voice firm but gentle. Nods and murmurs of affirmation rippled through the crowd. The flight attendants moved quickly to reassure the passengers and check for injuries. The elderly man approached Lucy, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "That was impressive work," he said, his voice warm with admiration. Lucy managed a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Thank you." The man waved her gratitude away. "Just glad I could help. You've got guts, young lady." Lucy's smile widened, but it quickly faded as she turned her attention back to the hijacker. "We need to make sure he's secured until we land," she said to the flight attendants. "And someone needs to contact the cockpit to inform the captain." One of the attendants nodded and hurried toward the front of the plane. Lucy knelt beside the hijacker, who glared at her with venomous eyes. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You have no idea what's coming." Lucy didn't flinch. "You've already lost," she said evenly. "Whatever you were planning, it ends here." The man sneered but said nothing more. Lucy stood, her gaze sweeping the cabin. The passengers were calmer now, their trust in her evident. The weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her, but she felt a surge of pride knowing she had done what needed to be done. As the plane continued its journey, Lucy took a moment to sit and catch her breath. The elderly man sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot today," he said. "But you handled it with grace." Lucy glanced at him, her eyes softening. "I just did what I had to do," she replied. "I couldn't sit by and let him hurt anyone." The man nodded, his respect for her evident. "The world needs more people like you." Lucy didn't respond, but his words stayed with her. She looked out the window, the clouds below a reminder of how high they had come. Despite the challenges, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath. The plane's engines hummed steadily, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. With the hijacker securely restrained and the passengers settling into uneasy calm, Lucy finally had a moment to take stock of the situation. She remained vigilant, her eyes trained on the subdued man who now sat under the watchful eyes of two flight attendants. The elderly man, still seated beside her, broke the silence. "You should be proud of yourself," he said, his tone gentle. "Most people wouldn't have had the courage to do what you did." Lucy shook her head slightly. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "You distracted him, and the flight attendants were brave enough to act. This was a team effort." The man gave her a small, knowing smile. "Maybe so. But it takes a leader to bring people together in moments like this." Lucy didn't respond immediately, her thoughts drifting to the passengers around her. The fear and suspicion that had initially filled their eyes had been replaced by something else, respect. For the first time since boarding, she felt seen, not as a target of prejudice, but as someone they could trust. The flight attendants soon approached Lucy, their expressions a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. The lead attendant, a woman with blonde hair tied back in a tight bun, addressed her cautiously. "Ma'am," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we've informed the captain of what happened. He's contacted air traffic control, and will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport." Lucy nodded. "Good. Make sure the authorities are ready to meet us on the ground. And let the captain know the situation is under control for now." The attendant hesitated, then added, "We owe you a debt of gratitude. You saved all of us today." Lucy offered her a small, tired smile. "I just did what anyone with my training would do." The attendant's gaze lingered for a moment before she nodded and returned to the front of the cabin. The other flight attendants resumed their duties, offering water and quiet reassurances to the passengers. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What had driven him to such a desperate act? And, most pressing of all, had they truly neutralized the threat, or were there still unknown dangers? She decided to find answers. Rising from her seat, she approached the restrained hijacker, her gaze steady. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, filled with defiance and hatred. "What was your plan?" Lucy asked, her voice low but firm. The man sneered. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Lucy countered, her tone unwavering. "You're already caught. Whatever message you wanted to send, it's not going anywhere unless you tell someone." The man's sneer faltered slightly, and for a moment, Lucy thought he might answer. But then his expression hardened, and he leaned back in his seat, silent. Lucy sighed and straightened. She'd encountered men like him before, angry, consumed by a need to assert control. Whatever had motivated him, it was clear he had no intention of revealing it now. She turned and walked back to her seat, her mind already shifting to the next steps. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing at Denver International Airport in approximately 20 minutes. Emergency personnel will be waiting to assist us. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we come to a complete stop. Thank you." A ripple of unease passed through the cabin, but Lucy could see that the passengers were regaining their composure. They whispered among themselves, some casting grateful glances in her direction. The elderly man beside her gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Almost there," he said. Lucy nodded, though her mind remained alert. 20 minutes was still plenty of time for something to go wrong. As the plane began its descent, Lucy noticed the hijacker shifting in his seat. His movements were subtle, but she didn't miss the way his fingers flexed against the zip ties. She rose from her seat and approached the flight attendants. "He's trying to loosen his restraints," she warned. "We need to keep him under close watch until we land." One of the attendants nodded, her face pale. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on him." Lucy returned to her seat but kept her gaze trained on the hijacker. The plane's descent was smooth, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. When the wheels finally touched down, a collective sigh of relief swept through the passengers. The plane taxied to a remote section of the airport, where a line of emergency vehicles waited. Police officers and federal agents surrounded the aircraft, their presence a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Once the engines powered down, the flight attendants began guiding passengers off the plane, starting with those in the economy section. Lucy waited until the majority of the passengers had disembarked before approaching the lead flight attendant. "Make sure the authorities know everything that happened," she said. "And let them know I'm willing to provide a statement." The attendant nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you again, ma'am. We're lucky you were here." As Lucy stepped off the plane, the cool air hit her face, a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the cabin. She was met by a tall man in a dark suit, his badge identifying him as an FBI agent. "Rear Admiral Barnes?" he asked, his tone respectful. Lucy nodded. "That's correct. I'm Special Agent Carter," he said, extending a hand. "We'll need a full debrief, but first, let me just say, what you did up there was extraordinary." Lucy shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you, Agent Carter. I'll do whatever I can to assist." As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Lucy glanced back at the plane. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also reaffirmed something she'd always believed: in moments of crisis, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges. And sometimes, leadership meant stepping up when it mattered most. She turned her gaze forward, her resolve stronger than ever. The day wasn't over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Recognition and reflection. Lucy sat in a quiet room at Denver International Airport, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. The sterile walls and hum of the air conditioning felt almost surreal after the adrenaline-fueled events on the plane. Across the table, Special Agent Carter reviewed his notes, occasionally glancing up at her with a mix of respect and curiosity. "Rear Admiral Barnes," he began, "first of all, thank you for your bravery. It's clear your actions prevented what could have been a much worse situation." Lucy nodded, her expression composed. "I did what anyone in my position would have done. The safety of the passengers was my priority." Carter's lips twitched into a small smile. "That may be true, but not everyone would have had the training or presence of mind to handle it as effectively as you did. Your military background clearly played a key role." "It's what I was trained for," Lucy said simply. Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression growing serious. "The hijacker is in custody, and we're questioning him now. Preliminary information suggests he acted alone, but we'll continue investigating to confirm that. Your insight and quick thinking will be crucial in understanding his motives." Lucy inclined her head. "I'll provide whatever information you need." Carter closed his notebook and set it aside. "Before we wrap this up, there's something else I wanted to mention. The passengers and crew have been speaking highly of you. The airline plans to issue a formal commendation, and I wouldn't be surprised if this incident gains media attention." Lucy's brow furrowed slightly. She had never sought the spotlight and didn't relish the idea of becoming a public figure. "My priority was ensuring everyone's safety," she said carefully. "I'm not looking for recognition." Carter studied her for a moment before nodding. "Understood. But sometimes, stories like this inspire others. It's worth considering." After the debriefing, Lucy was escorted to a private lounge where some of the passengers were waiting. As she entered, the room fell silent. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of how to respond to the sea of faces turned toward her. Then, the elderly man she had worked with on the plane stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "Rear Admiral Barnes," he said, his voice warm and steady. "On behalf of everyone here, thank you. You saved our lives today." A ripple of applause spread through the room, and Lucy felt her cheeks warm. She raised a hand, motioning for quiet. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm but humble. "But I wasn't alone in this. The flight attendants, the passengers, we all played a part in ensuring everyone's safety. It was a collective effort, and I'm proud of how we came together in such a difficult situation. The crowd murmured in agreement, their respect for her evident. One of the flight attendants approached, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've never been so scared in my life," she admitted. "But seeing you take control gave me the courage to act. You're an inspiration." Lucy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were brave. Don't underestimate what you did today. It takes strength to stay calm under pressure." The attendant nodded, her gratitude shining through. As the evening wore on, Lucy found herself reflecting on the events of the day. She had faced discrimination, humiliation, and danger, yet she had emerged stronger. The passengers who had once judged her based on their biases now saw her for who she truly was, a leader, a protector, and a person deserving of respect. She thought about the hijacker's words, his anger and hatred. Whatever had driven him to such desperation, she knew it was a reminder of the challenges that still existed in the world. But she also knew that moments like these, moments of courage and unity, could spark change. Lucy's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her commanding officer. "Proud of you, Barnes. The Navy is lucky to have you." A small smile touched her lips. She typed a quick reply and set the phone aside, her gaze drifting to the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world she had sworn to protect. The next morning, as Lucy prepared to board a new flight to her original destination, she was approached by the elderly man from the plane. "Heading out already?" he asked with a grin. "Duty calls," Lucy replied. He extended a hand. "Take care of yourself. And thank you again." Lucy shook his hand firmly. "You too. Stay safe." As she boarded the plane, Lucy felt a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the previous day had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but they had also reminded her of the strength that came from standing firm in the face of adversity. As the plane took off, Lucy looked out the window, the clouds below a symbol of the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead. Whatever the future held, she knew she was ready.